folks, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to try to tackle the age-old question again of how do airsoft barrel length affects performance. And we've talked about this subject before, back about 2 years ago, if you remember. And during that time in the video, we kind of found out like it looks like, or it seems that the barrel length, the longer the barrel length, the better the groupings, sort of. Although there were a lot of confounding variables and it was hard to really tease that out, but that was the trend. Now, the problem though, again, is like with all the confoundings, we were doing different manufacturers, different types of guns, so we were comparing not just WE versus Marui versus SRC, whatever, it was not only that, but it was also different rifles versus pistols versus SMGs. So it was, it was too different, and so it's very difficult to compare and see head to head and eliminate all those variables and just tease out just the barrel length itself. And the reason why, of course, is, for example, obviously, or at least for me, having a Glock sight picture with the Glock sights is a lot harder to get more accurate shots than having, say, an AR peep sight to look through. And so to do that, we're going to solve all this, or eliminate as many confounding factors as we can. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to repeat the test, but using just one platform. Originally, I was actually going to just compare it to 3 different ARs, using the Marui, the WE M733 right here, and the CAR 15, a 10-inch barrel, an 11.5-inch, and a 14.5-inch barrel. But that's a manufacturer difference, and there are ergonomics differences along them. So just to make things even easier or more consistent, we're just going to do just the WE, and we're going to do all the barrel length in one platform, and we're going to try to keep everything as consistent as we can. So let's get into the 3 different setups that we're going to use within the M733 model right here. I did just paint this, by the way, so it looks kind of a little funky. I know that shading needs to be a little bit darker, so I probably got to redo it, but everything else is the same. So the very beginning, by the way, what I started out was doing the 10.5-inch barrel right here. If you measure it out, you'll see it's 10.5, but the reality is the true brass component from just the brass part is probably really about like 10 inches, but I'm going to be referring to it as the 10.5-inch baseline. This is the same model as the very, very original one I got like 4 or 5 years ago, and the same hop-up unit and everything like that. I also have a new one that I'm going to use as the full-length version. This is the original M4 barrel. It says here 15.5 inches, right? 15 inches, but of course that's really with just the hop-up assembly and hop-up chamber right here that adds to it. So if you were to subtract that, the brass component of only is really about 14.5 inches. So it would look like this, and that's how I would fire it in the 14.5-inch configuration. Keep in mind though that there's no outer barrel or anything like that. And then of course, to get the middle of the road, the 11.5-inch barrel, or the M733 configuration right here. This is like my favorite setup I have right here. But if you remember, this is actually the older model I had, where it was truly just a 10.5-inch barrel underneath there, and this part right here was just like the barrel extension attached to it, and there was no real inner barrel, brass barrel right there. So I don't think that really counts, because all intent and purposes, it really was just a 10.5-inch barrel. But unfortunately, as this part was starting to crack, I finally got a replacement part for it. And so I was able to get a replacement part for it, and ultimately once I did the testing for the 14.5-inch barrel, I cut it up so it became an 11.5-inch barrel. Again, it says 12 here, but if you subtract the hop-up chamber, it would become an 11.5-inch right there. So I'll be referring to this as the 11.5-inch barrel component, which is supposed to be true to the original Model 733 configuration anyway. So that's the whole point of the setup. The outer extension, by the way, was very hard to find from WE himself, but I was able to find a G&P one right here after carefully considering the different thread directions, but they make both counterclockwise and clockwise directions, and you got to make sure you match the male and female end, and to make sure all those are set up. But I was able to get one, and even though this outer barrel is a little bit thicker than the WE original, it doesn't look too bad, as you can see right here. Um, that's the barrel extension from G and P right there. Notice how it's a little bit darker and thicker than the original part right here. Um, but the important thing to real point out though is again, it's a true inner barrel that stretches all the way from the chamber all the way to the very end. Of course, we don't include the muzzle device in this case. So as you can see here, this is the 10.5-inch barrel at about 27 feet. I fired about 8 shots here. Sorry about the no sound. I had some copyright issues here. I had some music playing. I shouldn't have done that. But anyway, so that's the first round. Then we moved on to the 14.5-inch barrel, and we are firing the same distance, around 8 or 9 shots again, as you can see there. Then after that, I chopped down the barrel, and now we're going at 7 or 11.5 inch. This is all, by the way, using the long range aperture, the small sight picture. Finally, following it by the same 11.5-inch barrel, but using a short range aperture. And notice how it lands very tight groupings right there, and much closer to the target because it's adjusted for elevation. Okay, so this was actually at 27 feet roughly after measuring it. I know I wrote 25 here, but it's actually at 27 after measuring it with tape. So let's start from the very beginning here at the 10.5-inch barrel here. If we were to measure with a standard grouping to see the widest distance apart of any of the grouping sides, you'll notice just from here to here, that's the largest or the widest, and that's about 3.5 inches. For the 11.5, from here to here, that's about 2.5 inches. And then from on the 15 or 14.5-inch barrel, that's from either from here to here is the same as from here to here, and that's about 3.5 inches. Or sorry, 3 inches. 3 inches. So I really don't think I mean, I really don't think you can make a claim so far that there is from these shots right here that there's much of a difference in accuracy from a 10.5, 11.5 to a 14.5-inch barrel. You might even be able to make an argument that the groupings here on the 10.5-inch right here is probably where the majority of the shots are hitting, and that these two right here may be actually outliers, and that's just really just me then causing it. And the reality is that most of them are pretty tight, and then but these here on the 11.5, there's no real direction. I mean, I know a little bit more hit here, but there's not a whole lot of grouping centered anywhere. Same thing with here, a very wide grouping. So, and I wouldn't say that longer barrel was worsening accuracy. It's just that's just probably just me. So, just from that standpoint alone, I wouldn't say that just because this had slightly larger groupings, technically it is the widest. But you can be the judge of that, and I don't think that's really the case that there's any sacrifices in accuracy, right? If anything, there might be something with just me being the shooter. What is more interesting, though, that I didn't really notice, though, is that it's funny how flipping the sights, and these were all done, by the way, all three of these were done using the long range aperture, with the exception of this right here, where it says O2. So as soon as I switched over to the O2, I noticed that it got a lot closer groupings, and I wonder if it's just because the sites were larger and it's easier to see and you kind of can adjust a little bit better. Whereas with these, the apertures are really small, so you really don't really see it until after you're done firing it, just like this and just like this. I don't know. But one thing that's kind of interesting is that at 27 feet, we were kind of expecting this point of impact. Remember, I'm aiming at the dead center in each of them. Now, at 27, we know before from our prior graphs and everything that it's going to hit about half an inch or an inch high with the WE. But notice how as soon as the barrel changes length, the point of impact shifts up by a couple inches actually. And then a little bit higher for the 14.5 inch. So what's going on here? If we were to check this out, remember we were saying 27-inch feet from the target, right? At 27 feet from the target, let's say it's roughly here, we really should be using the long range aperture. We really should be close to about 1.5 inches above where you're aiming, which if you go back, 1.5 inches above where you're aiming, which would be kind of roughly right there. So that's exactly like as we expected, right? And again, this was the whole chart from our previous video on how to use the iron sights. So go back and check out that video. But what's going to be interesting now is why would the rest of them grow up all of a sudden? And I think this comes back to the idea of, and I was kind of thinking back on like a middle school physics or science class where, do you remember that monkey and the shooting physics example homework assignment, where if you had like say a monkey that was trained to drop its tail and fall off a tree as soon as it sees you firing, right, so it can avoid getting shot. The question the teacher always asks you is that if you knew that monkey did that, would you aim lower than the monkey so that as soon as you shoot it and the monkey drops, it hits it? Or would you continue aiming at the monkey? Or would you do something crazy and aim at the top, above the monkey? And no one would choose that answer, obviously. And most people would choose aim below the monkey so that if when you shoot it, the monkey drops, it hits the monkey. But the reality of it is, in that example, is that gravity affects the monkey as well as the projectile at the same rate, really, right? I mean, it's always affecting it, but as soon as it leaves the barrel, the round is, no matter how fast it's falling or if traveling, it's still being pushed downward by gravity as much as the monkey is being pushed down. So you're really supposed to be aiming at the monkey, because what's happening is as the monkey drops, your round is also dropping too. So you're never losing. Um, I guess, any. Uh, you're not losing your aim basically by compensating. So how does that really apply in this situation? So theoretically, we saw in this that aiming here put us here. So it's almost about like an inch or two above where we were expecting it, right? So at 27 feet, we were hitting it around half an inch, but we were really seeing it really about like an inch above that, so 1.5, which is probably right here or right here on this graph. And the reason why is I think it's just like that monkey example. If you think about it, as soon as the BB leaves the round, right, the gun, gravity starts pulling it down because the barrel is no longer supporting it. But if you have a longer barrel, it gets to travel in that trajectory longer before gravity is affected. And that means it could fly higher. And so, as you saw here, that's why instead of being dropped down to only zero point 0.5 above the point of impact, or before above the line of sight, it's falling well above that. And that's probably because it has more travel time without being pulled down by gravity because the barrel is longer. So theoretically, and we'll test this, theoretically, it should look something like this, right? So I mean, 27, I'm drawing that by myself. Everything should be shifted up, right? Because it leaves the barrel later, and if it leaves the barrel later, it doesn't get affected by gravity that much or as quickly, and so it has more time to stay above. And theoretically, if this is the true case, that means that the round would fly higher, and if the rounds fly higher by a couple inches, right, that means you're going to get an extra like 5 or 10 feet of range basically from a longer barrel, which is great, right? And that kind of makes sense too, right? Longer barrels, you get longer range. Um, and that's kind of the theory, but let's see if that's actually true. So I tested again using just the long range aperture and see, and lo and behold, look, this is what you get. I have never seen something as consistent as this before. That is ridiculously consistent. But look at how it goes. It's a very um, solid trajectory. And if you were to map those two together, like so, you remember the previous chart, that was the previous line before, and that's the new one right here with the 10 and a half, sorry, it's a 10 and a half inch barrels right here, and then the 11 and a half inch right here. Again, that's just how we predicted it. It's going to be a shift up, right? Meaning you're going to get, it's going to, because it's less, it gets, gravity affects it later rather than sooner, and because of that, it gets more time elevated. I hope that makes sense the way I'm explaining it. At least I think that's how what's happening. Is it possible maybe, I put in the barrel slightly differently? Maybe, but again, everything was pretty consistent though. I even used the same hop-up chamber because the original one wouldn't fit in there, or the new one wouldn't fit in there, so I had to use the old one. So the only thing that was changed was the long barrel, or the brass barrel itself. Even the hop-up unit, I didn't even set the hop-up. So at this range, there's no effect of the hop-up. The hop-up doesn't even, the backspin from the hop-up doesn't really take effect until closer to 40 or 50 feet out. And so at this point, you can really tell that that's just the longer barrel probably affecting it. Now, I know before when we saw the groupings didn't seem to make much of a difference, whether it's an 11 and a half, 10 and a half, or 14 and a half 14 and a half inch. But it is interesting to note, though, that at 10.5 inch barrels do seem to have a lot of variability, right? Whereas look at these up and down waves here, and we always have to draw a trend line to see this. Whereas in this case, with the 11.5 inch barrel, there's a lot more stability. And again, it's not a perfect line, but that's pretty darn good right there. So again, even though the groups aren't different, I do suspect that with a longer barrel, you do get less effect or influence from the outside forces that might, in general, shift all your groups one way or another. So even though your groups might be landing in the same spot, they're less, I don't know, more likely to be affected and shift up or down, as you can see in these charts, whereas a lot more predictable with the 11.5 inch barrel, even though the groupings themselves aren't necessarily aren't significantly different. So after we ran this test, I think there's a little bit better validity than compared the first time we done it. And so I think to summarize, I would say that, does a 10.5 inch barrel significantly worse than a 14.5 inch barrel, or maybe even a 20 inch barrel? Yeah, probably not that big of a deal in terms of grouping sizes. But we did notice that there was a kind of a kernel of benefit in terms of it seems to be a more reliable, predictable response when you have a longer barrel compared to a shorter barrel. We also noticed, though, that you probably get a little bit more range out of that. I couldn't confirm, through actual testing of the range, but based on the trajectory of the rounds and the shift in impact compared to a shorter barrel, compared to a longer barrel, that's likely the case. But in the end, you really shouldn't have to decide whether you want a long barrel or short barrel because of accuracy. For the most part, you should pick it up based on what you like, because that's not going to play a huge factor on it compared to in all scheme of things. Hope you folks enjoy that content. See y'all next time.